Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Can you hear me now? Thank you. As president of the board of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, it's an honor to be introducing the annual Sylvia Jisu Memorial Lecture. Sylvia was born in Brooklyn, New York in July of 1912, the child of immigrants from Berlin and the Bialystok area of Russia. At the age of 4, she contracted polio, which affected the left side of her body, and many years later led to post-polio syndrome. But that experience seemed to strengthen rather than diminish her throughout her life. She went to Brooklyn College, studied speech therapy, and later pursued a career in teaching. In 1936, she married Max Zucker, whom she had met while she was in college. Max had been born in Poland, had grown up in Vienna, and immigrated to the United States with his family at the age of 8. And in 1982, after his death, Sylvia moved to Santa Rosa. At an event commemorating the Holocaust held on this campus in 1983, the university president, Peter Diamandopoulos, was the keynote speaker. After the event, he challenged Robert L. Harris, who was that year's coordinator, to do more than just memorialize the Holocaust annually. Harris asked a number of people to assist him in responding to the president's challenge, including Sylvia. We heard more about the founding of the Alliance at an earlier lecture this semester. Sylvia was not only an active member of the Alliance and the planning committee for the annual community-wide Yom HaShoah commemorations for many years, but encouraged local Holocaust survivors to tell their stories to students in local middle and high schools, a tradition which is now part of the mission of the Alliance's Education Committee. This year, members of that committee supported Holocaust and Genocide survivors and their descendants in speaking to over 3,000 students and 140 teachers in Sonoma County schools about the impact of intolerance and bullying. We are indebted to Sylvia for her amazing skills in creating an endowment name for a former SSU faculty member, Alliance board member, and Holocaust survivor, Paul V. Benko. After Paul's death in 1999, Sylvia almost single-handedly contacted members of the community to create a fund in his memory, the proceeds of which is one of the major sources of the annual funding for the speakers in this series. In an interview in 2003, she said, "You know, life is full of little quirks and twists. You may get thrown for a little, but then you've got to straighten up and brush yourself off and go on." Sylvia died in June of 2017, just short of her 104th birthday. She continues to inspire us, and we are so pleased that her daughter, Saib Amar, is able to be with us this afternoon. And we're also grateful to Arline Thomas, who is out tabling, and to Professor Myrna Goodman for underwriting today's lecture. It's our tradition to remember any Holocaust survivors in our community who've died in the past year. This year, we're remembering 2 survivors, Esther Hershkovitz and Susie Rayful. Esther was born in 1922 in Czechoslovakia, the second of 5 children, and lived her first 16 years in that country until she moved to Hungary in 1938 to pursue training as a dental technician. The area of Hungary would become a ghetto during the early 1940s. She managed to evade transport until April of 1944, when Eichmann ordered the deportation of all the remaining Jews. Esther and her 3 sisters were all deported to various camps. In September of 1944, Esther was sent to Bergen-Belsen, and from there in December to a factory in Leipzig, where as a forced laborer, she riveted bolts into airplane wings for the Junkers Company, a Nazi subcontractor. And I'm sure you've been studying about some of these situations in the course. As the war was winding down, she was subjected to a final death march, but managed to escape along with one sister and her aunt with the assistance of Flemish partisans. She was liberated on May 1st, 1945 in Germany, and after living briefly in Paris, she and her sister sailed to New York City, and miraculously, her aunt and all three of her sisters survived. She married Henry Hershkovitz in January of 1949, and they and their two sons lived first in New York, then in Cleveland, and then Sacramento. She lived for several years in Santa Rosa to be near her son Arnie, and attended several of the Yom HaShoah commemorations. She died very recently in April of this year. Susie Rayful was born in 1925 and raised in Budapest in Hungary, and she and her two sisters were put into a German workhouse in the Budapest ghetto. At the end of that year, they were deported and began the trek through several camps, beginning with Ravensbrück. Susie was among 150 young girls, survivors of 1,500 young women, who were part of what came to be known as the Helmsbrecht Death March. The American Army rescued her during the first week of May of 1945. Some weeks later, Susie met a young American soldier, and she later confessed it was love at first sight. She returned to Budapest to concentrate on regaining her full strength and health, and 2 years later came to America to marry that soldier. They moved to Santa Rosa in 1990 and were in constant contact with their two sons and spouses, as well as their 5 grandchildren. Susie said 3 things sustained her throughout her ordeal: the good Lord, her mother's teachings, and the strength of her sister Mary, who kept her going. After all the hate and suffering, she said that she still believed that people are basically good. She died this past December. And finally, we remember Paul Ziegelbaum, a Holocaust descendant and beloved member of our community. He and his brother Arthur created an endowment fund in honor of their mother Adele, a Holocaust survivor. It supports a dedicated lecture in the series every other year. Paul died in January. May their memories be a blessing for all those whose lives their stories have touched. Finally, the Alliance co-sponsors an annual community-wide commemoration of the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah, with other organizations in Sonoma County. This year's program will be held this Sunday, May 5th, from 2 to 4 in Santa Rosa. The theme will be La Dor Vador, from generation to generation. We hope you'll be able to join us. Copies of the flyer for the commemoration will be on the stage as you leave today. If any college or high school student with us is interested in serving as an escort for Holocaust survivors or candlelighter commemorating one of the more recent genocides at that gathering, please see me after today's lecture. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to introduce Dr. Alexis Hare. We're very happy to have her back with us this semester. Dr. Hare holds a doctorate in Holocaust history at the only university in the country that offers such a degree. It's at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. She is currently, but not for long, the Associate Director of the Jewish Family and Children's Services Holocaust Center in San Francisco and has been there for a number of years. She just shared with me that she is going to, as of this week, throw her hat back into the teaching ring, and she'll be teaching at San Francisco State and the University of San Francisco, and those are 2 very lucky universities. Dr. Hare has held teaching positions at Keene State College, with which we're familiar because it's the home of our good friend Jim Waller, and Northeastern University. She is the recipient of numerous prestigious fellowships and awards for her work in Holocaust and Genocide studies. Dr. Hare is the author of The Holocaust and Compensated Compliance in Italy, and she has also edited 2 major volumes on essential reference guides to Rwanda and to Sudan. Dr. Hare is here today to discuss with us her insight into the ongoing crisis in Darfur, a current genocide. Again, we are dealing with a genocide that happens at this moment, that has been going on for a decade and a half and has completely disappeared from the front pages of Western newspapers. With the recent ouster of Omar al-Bashir after a mere 30 years as the wretched dictator of Sudan, perhaps the world's attention will again be turned to Darfur. It certainly needs to be, because there is so much suffering still there. And I look forward to hearing what Dr. Hare has to say about this tragic situation. Please welcome her.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me okay? Some of you still said hello. That's pretty nice. What about now? Better? Yeah? Okay, great. I am so excited to be back here. It is such a pleasure to sit here and speak with you today. Yeah, does that help? Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. As I was saying, I'll say it again louder. I'm very happy to be here because I am excited to talk with you about Darfur. When I was a freshman in college, this genocide had begun, and it was the first time that I started to realize that genocide was happening now in the present. It wasn't something of the past, and it became something I cared about for now way too many years because it's continuing. The inspiration for my talk today, I don't have a clicker today, so I'm going to nod at our person in the booth. Go ahead and click that again. Is a quote that comes from Elie Wiesel. Magic. Listening to a witness makes you a witness. The reality is I have studied genocide for far too many years that I want to count, and I continue to do so because I can't stop doing so. The things that resonate with me most deeply, the things that I remember most strongly, are not dates, are not numbers, are not statistics. They are things that I have heard from survivors. At the end of the day, it's testimony that will resonate with us most strongly. And the reason for that is it builds connection. It's hard to see ourselves in a number of 6 million. It's hard to see your face there. But when you hear a story 1 in 6 million, for example, or 1 in 2 million, you start to build connection and realize how present an experience can be. Originally, I had planned to speak with you today about Darfur exclusively. However, due to recent events, I have to change my talk. I'm going to nod again, thank you. In December of last year, protests broke out in Sudan. Essentially, the government raised prices on bread and oil by 300% overnight. And people took to the streets. This was going to ruin their economy. It was going to ruin their ability to provide for themselves. So they started protesting. Within a week, these protests evolved from crying for better prices to calling for the overthrow of President al-Bashir. This is a man who is responsible for their ruined economy, who is responsible for bloodshed and violence, and it was time for a change. On April 11th, President Bashir was overthrown. Just to help you understand a little bit more about why this is so monumental, in the 30 years that he was in power, he committed many crimes, which the International Criminal Court is trying to hold him accountable for. Those charges include 5 counts of crimes against humanity. Those include murder, extermination, forcible transfer, torture, and rape, as well as 2 counts of war crimes, intentional directing acts against a civilian population or against individual civilians not taking part in the hostilities, so innocent bystanders, and 3 counts of genocide. This includes genocide by serious bodily or mentally harm, deliberately inflicting on each target group conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction. Because of al-Bashir, this country has forever been changed. It is changed at the micro level and the macro level. We can see it in the faces of those people who are in our newspapers protesting today. One thing that's very fascinating and really brings this point home, the kind of legacy of 30 years of dictatorial rule, is the fact that the median age of a Sudanese person today is just 19 years old. Okay, so I imagine that the median age of this room is above 19 actually. Okay, and to help put this in sharper relief, the median age in California is 38. What that means is the people who are demanding change in Sudan today have never lived under peace. Yet they are working hard to build it. Today, I want to think a little bit about the series title for this lecture this year, Genocide in Our Time, It Can Happen Here, and remind ourselves that genocide doesn't have an end and a start date, okay? The killing may end, like, for example, in the Holocaust, 1945, Auschwitz is liberated, the war is over. The remnants of that genocide continue. People are in DP camps, people are trying to find family members, they're trying to deal with the trauma of what they experienced, right? Darfur is a genocide that has been going on for far too many years, as well as trauma from the Civil War. So today what we're going to do is talk about stories from Darfur, stories from the Sudanese Civil War, and the revolution. In order to get at this question of what does it mean to have genocide now? What does it mean to have a legacy of genocide in a country that's demanding peace? And we're going to do it through stories. The first one is the story of Richard Bakit. I had the good fortune of meeting Richard about 1.5 years ago now. And I have been interviewing him and working with him to find a way to tell his story, hopefully in a book. Richard was born in the small town of Pagari. It's in South Sudan. Nodding. I love this graphic, sorry, I had to pause for it. So he's from this small town in South Sudan. All the way up north is Khartoum, which is thousands and thousands of miles, it feels like, away from the town in which he was born. Khartoum is the city center. It's where there are hospitals. It's where there is education, where there's a university. He grew up in a hut that looks like this, not in a high-rise. In fact, he was born in a hut like this. He doesn't know when he was born because there was no birth certificate. There was no hospital. This is kind of one of the stressors and challenges within Sudan. The government has been protecting the capital and providing for people within the capital and not for people in the peripheral regions of the country. This also will include Darfur. Okay. One of the best ways for me to introduce you to Richard, but also his identity and the legacy that he was born into as a South Sudanese man, is to talk about his name. So his first name is Richard, which is a Christian name. You might not have expected that someone from South Sudan is named Richard. You might have an uncle named Richard, right? The reason why his name is Richard is because of the colonial history of this country. The country had been occupied from 1898 until 1956 by British and Egyptian forces. Essentially, it was all under British control, but because Sudan is the largest country in Africa, it's massive, they split the country in half. And in the north, you had Egyptian rule or Arab rule, and in the south, you had British rule. Richard is a Christian name because the British brought with them Christianity. They colonized the country and they started proselytizing Christianity. His next name is Beku. I told you he was born in this small hut. He was given the name Richard by his parents. That's the name he was baptized with. But he also has a community name, a name that's given to him by everyone in Pagari. They all gathered outside of a hut, and they looked at this baby and they said, okay, your name is Beku. I remember I asked Richard, what does that mean? He goes, little one. He's a very petite man. His next name is Akara. This is the family surname that his family has had for generations and generations and generations. It is linked in many ways to his tribal identity as a member of the Mahdi tribe. He told me that if I ever go to South Sudan and I go to Pagari, just tell them that I know the Akaras, and they'll know exactly where the land is, where the family is, because they had been there for many, many, many years. His last name is Bakit. This is a name that his great-great-grandfather had to take on, because when the British finally left, we had war break out, and his family was forced to assume an Arab last name in order to be able to work in the community and make a living. So he has all these different names. They're all different layers. He really just goes, to me, he goes by Richard, but at home when he was growing up, he was Beku. His life is in so many ways an inherited trauma because of this challenge between the north and the south of Sudan, between this one group that identifies as Muslim and the other that identifies as Christian. To add another layer to this, you have in the north, the government saying that the people who are in the north are actually Arabs, whereas those in the south are Black Africans. This is because the Egyptians came and colonized, and so they think that they're closer to the Egyptians. They're closer to Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. So that's why there is this idea that in the north, they're the Arabs. In the south, they're the blacks. They're the Africans, and they happen to also be Christians. There had been a civil war already before he was born. Fortunately, that war had ended in 1972. Essentially, the government finally said, okay, we're going to do as the South demands. They want greater representation in the government. They want to continue to practice Christianity and not have to practice Islam. Fine. Then oil was discovered in the South. And war broke out again. When describing this, Richard told me an African proverb. When two elephants are fighting in the grass, it is the grass that suffers. In this scenario, he was the grass. When he was 6 years old, the family started to hear about instances of the government forces coming to villages around them and burning down villages and raping women and stealing. In order to prevent such an attack or atrocity happening to the town people in Pagari, the elders of the town said, all right, let's take the women and the children and put them in the fields. So they went to live in the farmland about 6 kilometers outside of where the main center of the town was. And they hid there and waited. This is some images for us of what was happening all over South Sudan. Government forces would come in and they would burn these towns to the ground. This is an example of one of those tuckles, one of those huts that you saw that Richard was born in. Here it is destroyed. Essentially, they were running a scorched earth campaign. Children and women, non-combatants, elderly were all victims. It didn't matter. The government forces came in and took out everyone. Richard's town was very lucky because members of the town who had been forced to serve in the army came back and warned them that the attack was coming. And so all of the children, Richard included, were brought together in the fields and divided into groups of 4 to 6 children. Each child had a woman who was her guide, or were their guide. They were about 16 years old, is what I was told. And they started to wander into the bush, trying to escape these annihilations. When I asked Richard what he remembers about this time, he was, like I said, 6. He told me that it was the sounds. He heard nonstop gunfire and the sound of helicopters. I remember when I was the age of the students in this room and I first started hearing about the Darfur Genocide, it was the helicopters that the activists were focusing on. And I never really understood the significance of that until I heard the story. The reason for that was the government of Sudan was purchasing helicopters from China and from Russia and using them to literally hunt down its people from the sky. In fact, there is a book called Fire from the Sky describing some of these incidences. Luckily, Richard was able to escape. When I asked him about this, how he thinks about the perpetrators, the murderers, he told me this: human beings are dealing with the monsters, and the monster is in us. At the end of the day, he saw himself in these government troops. They had families. They believed in what they were doing. They thought it was for the right reasons. They didn't think that they were doing injustice. A jihad had been proclaimed, so their crimes were considered religiously just, ethically just. And so this young man who has experienced hell and somehow survived to tell me about it can still see himself in the perpetrators. Eventually, Richard made it to Uganda. After 2 to 3 months of wandering in the desert, they took a very looped path because they would hear gunfire and have to go somewhere and hide, and eventually makes it to this camp in Uganda and meets up with his parents, both of whom survive. His sister does not make it. She dies in the first refugee camp. But the family is able to unite, and eventually Richard, after 11 years, makes it to the Bay Area and lives in San Francisco. When we talk about this, and like I said, I'm trying to help him write a book about his experiences. When we talk about this, I always ask him, what do you want people to know? What do you want kids to know? What do you want students to know about South Sudan and what you've experienced? This is what he's told me. Life is a gift and the most important thing we are given. When we forget its value, bad things happen. His life was forever changed because the government decided that his life was of no value. Instead, what was of value was money and power. When we forget the inherent value in every life around us, bad things happen. The next story we're going to talk through is one from Darfur. Kaltuma Mohammed Adam. When I started off explaining the South Sudan and the civil war there, we talked about how the distinctions between the population in the north was Arab and Muslim, in the south was African and Christian. It's different when you come to Darfur because everyone there, 99% of the population is Muslim, practicing Muslim. So instead you have 2 different groups which the community is divided into. You have people who are farmers, essentially people who live in villages. They have cattle as well, but they're sedentary, they're not moving around. And then you have herders, okay? All of whom who are practicing Islam. The difference between these 2 groups, according to the government, is their racial or ethnic identity. Again, it's this kind of myth that the people who are in Darfur are actually, by and large, Africans and not Arabs. So same culture, same traditions, arbitrary ethnic distinction. These 2 groups have gotten along more or less for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then drought starts to happen repeatedly. And it changes the dynamic between these 2 groups. Before, they were able to live peacefully. However, the drought changed that dynamic because now the herders were coming in and encroaching on the farmland of those who lived in these towns and villages. Kaltuma was born in the western province of Darfur. Like Richard, she is hundreds of miles away from Khartoum, right, the city center, which means that she and her family and the people in this region are not getting the resources they need to have a successful livelihood. When the drought happens and hundreds of thousands of people are perishing, the government's not doing anything. They're not sending resources, and part of their claim is that they didn't know it was going on. So she is born in the mid-'80s in Western Darfur, and she also now is inheriting this legacy of unmet problems, of challenges, of 30 years of tension between these two groups because of lack of resources. When she was 16, so around 2002, some of these herders, some of these so-called Arabs, anytime I say that, I want to put it in quotations. Some of these so-called Arabs came to their farmland and stole 150 of their cattle, which is their complete livelihood. Her brother tried to stop them, and he was killed. She says of this injustice, "No one was arrested. The men who killed my brother or stole our cows. Our people did not have weapons, guns, and bows, and arrows, and spears are not weapons to use when battling those guns." A lot of this genocide has to do with impunity, okay? The genocide has not yet officially started, so to speak. This is 2002. However, you already have this tension, and because the government is not stepping in to protect anybody, it's able to continue. In response to the government doing nothing, Darfuris acted. Two rebel groups essentially attacked a military base in Darfur in order to get the government's attention. The government responded in force. And unfortunately, Kaltuma gets caught in the middle of it. On August 14th, 2003, a nearby village was attacked. And the scene is a lot like what you saw earlier of these burnt buildings, the attacking of everyone in this village. Two boys, 1 9, 1 10, were able to escape. They traveled for days by foot and ended up in Kaltuma's village. Both were injured, both had burns on their bodies. They had managed to escape a burning tukul, one of these huts. A week later, their parents arrived, but it was a sign of what was to come. Eventually, these same rebels arrived in their town. But because Kaltuma was from a larger village, the rebels decided to let it remain. Instead of burning it to the ground, they wanted to sap its resources, which included its women. Kaltuma explains her experience interacting with the so-called Janjaweed, devils on horseback, and what it was like for her to be in this town. She explained, "We were on donkeys when 4 Arabs approached with their weapons, Kalashnikovs, and they shot 4 bullets in the air and forced us to stop. 2 women in the middle of her group jumped off their donkeys and fled on foot. One of the other women went with me to try to protect me from rape, but then all 3 of the men shot their weapons into the air, and the child on the back of the other woman started screaming. I told them, instead of raping me, it is better to kill me." This story is hard to hear, but it's so important for us to hear. For most of history, women's bodies have become the bulwark to violence and atrocity. They are part of the landscape of genocide. When she was attacked, it was a clear sign for her that it was time to go. She returned home, and her husband was fortunately supportive and agreed that it was time for them to leave. So they gathered up what little they had They got on a donkey and they grabbed 2 of their children and a newborn and traveled for a week to reach Chad and the Goz Beta refugee camp there. They arrived in May 2004, and still no one had called what was going on there a genocide. One of the things that is incredible about genocide is how advanced we have become at studying it and marking its occurrence. In 2004, we were able to show by satellite image villages being destroyed. The government in Sudan, in Khartoum, denied any wrongdoing, said that none of this was happening, that there were just small tribal conflicts. This was not the case. And because of images like this, we are able to prove, in fact, that genocide was occurring. All of these little red marks, these fires, are images of the towns that were destroyed and bombed during the genocide just in 2004. Our government actually made history when it comes to the Darfur Genocide. We became the first country to call what was happening there genocide. Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of State, went and visited refugee camps there. Eventually, our government had been very involved with the Civil War in Sudan because images of Black Africans in the South being taken and turned into slaves in the North resonated with members of our Congress who were African American, and they became very involved in the negotiations to end that civil war. When they heard about the conflict in Darfur, there was silence, in part because they were working so hard on trying to broker a peace deal between the North and the South. Things changed, however, for Colin Powell when he went and visited with refugees in Chad and heard their stories, heard from people like Kaluma, and came back and said, this is genocide. After being interviewed, Kaluma said, here in Goz Beta, it is better. It's the refugee camp. But when I remember what the Arabs did to us, I am not happy at all. I have nothing more to say, but I thank you for coming and listening to my story. We want to explain our stories, but no one comes. Thank you so much for coming and listening. I am pleased to have explained my story to you. It's what I wanted. One of the hardest things to do when you're teaching about genocide is to tell students, help them understand that genocide is never inevitable. Despite the fact that we look at history as if it's in a river, that there are these strong currents that are already on the way, many things could have happened to divert the flow of water. I always tell my students that genocide doesn't happen overnight. We talked very briefly about that today, about this legacy of war and violence that this young woman and man were born into and how it deeply impacted their lives. The reality is that peace also doesn't happen overnight. Genocide is a completely new field of studies. We didn't even prosecute someone for crimes against humanity and genocide and war crimes until the Rwandan genocide, which was in 1994, right? So 1996 and through 1998, we had our first trial. That's how new this idea of justice is after genocide. That is how new the work of peace is in terms of trying to prevent atrocities like the ones we have studied today. Right now, we're seeing this change in Sudan. Again, after 30 years of dictatorial rule of someone who is responsible for genocide, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, these words are the language that we use to try and prevent and punish atrocity. They're legal terms, right? They're actual crimes that are mandated in the International Criminal Court. The fact that in Sudan right now people are calling for change literally gives me chills. I was in a classroom on April 11th, the day that Bashir was overthrown, and I sat down in front of my students and I told them, I know we're supposed to talk about the Holocaust today, but we have to talk for a second about Darfur. Can you imagine if Hitler had been overthrown by his own people? That's what's happening right now in Darfur. And in Sudan. And it's not just Darfuris, right? Darfuris are thousands of miles away, okay? People in South Sudan now have their own country. But all of Sudan knows what has happened because of oppression and are fighting hard to fix it. And they're not the only ones. There have been demonstrations all over the globe in solidarity and support of the Sudanese protests. This is one that took place in Berlin on February 16th. The leaders of this revolution are the Sudanese Professionals Association. On April 12th, the day after the overthrow of Bashir, they issued this statement. The figures that had rendered a good performance of the villain role, now intending to take on the role of hero as well, are figures with a known track record for conspiring against the country, having actively engaged in destroying its potential. The historical record is not admired by the Sudanese people and will not be overlooked just because one designation was replaced with another. Right after Bashir was overthrown, his second in command took over. He only lasted 24 hours because of the protests. Now a military command has taken over as well. And the Sudanese Professional Association is calling for civilian representation in the government. This is huge. This is an effort of peace, negotiation, and a brighter future. Unfortunately, as of this morning, the military forces who are in control are asking the protesters to leave and are saying that the protesters and their roadblocks are disrupting the ability of the government to distribute food and water, that the protest area is becoming dirty. None of this is actually true. You can go online, you can follow the Sudanese Professional Association on Twitter, and you can see images of them actually doing cleanup, of being very organized and very direct. They want peace for their country and not violence. I started off this presentation with a quote. Listening to a witness makes you a witness. I've thought a lot about this. I told you that I've studied this atrocity, I've studied the history of genocide for many, many years, and the things that I remember are these snippets I've heard from survivors. They're the stories of women who are in Auschwitz and are pushing empty baby carriages around over rocky roads for no reason, as just a form of torture, right? It's the story of another survivor who I met who was a child survivor of the Holocaust, and he said one of the most vibrant memories he has of the post-war period is when a soldier gave him a sugar cube and he didn't know what it was, and his mom said, put it in your mouth. He now is a huge sugar he's a huge sugar addict now. These are the stories that resonate with me and stick with me. They're the stories of victimization, but of strength and resilience. They're the experiences I have of listening to Richard describe the horrors that he experienced, but also his message of bringing positive energy to those around you, of protecting life at the expense of everything and valuing it above all else. We should listen to witnesses because they have lived it, right? We want to honor their experience and hear from them, but also help their voice be amplified, which is exactly what my goal was for today. I want to thank the university for giving me an opportunity to speak with you about this atrocity that has been part of my consciousness and part of my identity now for way too long. I'm so hopeful that Bashir's reign is over and that we will see trials, that he will stand for his crimes. And I am hopeful that you will never have to know a genocide that will last for more than 15 years. Thank you very much.